Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lisa Mae Simpson. I get to serve as the Vice President of Learning and Engagement at Forefront. In case you're not familiar with us, we are one of the few associations in the United States that represents both grant makers and nonprofits, as well as their advisors and their allies. And our mission is to build a vibrant social impact sector for all the people of Illinois. We do this by providing education, advocacy, and research, and by mobilizing our members around campaigns that advance the sector. We are really glad today to be partnering with members of the Circular Chicago Coalition for this discussion on reimagining inclusive economic mobility. Before we dive into today's content, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Everyone's lines are muted. That's just to keep the background noise to a minimum so we can all focus our attention on our panelists, but we really do welcome your questions. So please take a moment right now to locate the chat and the Q&A, which you should find at the bottom of your screen if you're using the Zoom app. Please type any questions that you have for our presenters into the Q&A. And we will answer those throughout the presentation. And please use the chat for any technical questions or to connect with your fellow attendees. And in fact, if you'd like to use the chat right now just to introduce yourself so we can get a sense of who's in the room with us, please feel free to type in your name, your organization, and where you're located today. Finally, we are recording this webinar, and that recording will be made available on the Forefront website afterwards if you'd like to review it then. So with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to our moderator for today, Renee Loper. Thank you, Renee. I'll let you take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa, for the warm welcome and introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I am excited to join you all today. We are in store for a rich conversation around circular economy and what it means both in terms of inclusive economic mobility and circularity on a local level. So as Lisa mentioned, my name is Renee Loper. I am Vice President of Program Innovation with Perrault Global, and we're an NGO that sits at the intersection of the public, private, and social sectors, literally existing to build bridges between each sector towards solving solvable problems. And very importantly, we ensure that the communities and populations that are most affected by those problems are part of the contributions toward the solution and at the table toward developing the solutions. Very simply stated, if you're interested in learning more, please do visit us on our website, www.perraultglobal.org. So I am joined by a few exceptional leaders in the circular economy field. First, we have Sabira Lakhani, who is product manager with Reaply, a Chicago-based social enterprise who very simply stated, and Sabira, I know I'm not going to do it justice, so please do add additional color when you speak later in our conversation. But Reaply has a technology platform that makes it easy and efficient for organizations in government, retail, higher education, and others to track, utilize, or share assets that they have before buying more. I need a Reaply in my personal life. I am certain, again, that I'm not doing justice, so Sabira will illustrate further when she speaks later. And next we have Jonathan Pereira, Executive Director of Plant Chicago, another Chicago-based organization that aims to cultivate local circular economies and equips people and businesses with the tools to live more sustainably. And one of the things that Jonathan will speak more about later in our conversation is how Plant Chicago describes circular economy at a local scale. And that's one that is collaborative and sustained by local circulation of materials, nutrients, knowledge, and money. And last, but by no means least, we have Peter Perrault, Head of Circular Economy for USA and Canada, who is with NL. And NL has operations in Illinois as well as around the world. And using Peter's words, NL is probably the largest company that you've never heard of. So NL is one of the most innovative, energy companies who is leading the private sector toward reimagining cities, and specifically reimagining the economic model that combines economic development, environmental sustainability, and social inclusion, all in areas of open innovation. And again, Peter will share more when he speaks shortly. So before we dive into our topic, we'd love to hear from you. We do have two very quick poll questions to help us better understand where each of you are in your understanding of circular economy and where you believe Illinois is as a state on its circular economy journey. So Lisa, I'll ask that you put our poll questions up there so hopefully everyone can see them. So you'll see number one, the question is, I would define a circular economy as option A, an economic model where recycling is at the center to ensure products stay in circulation as long as possible. Option B, a framework for an economy that is restorative and regenerative by design. And option C, an evolution of the linear take, make, use economic model that prioritizes innovation. So take a second and drop in what your understanding of a circular economy is. It is a little bit of a trick question because there's aspects of each of those answers in how we're defining circular economy. So don't be tricked. I'll give it maybe 5 more seconds or so. All right, let's see our responses. What do we have? A very informed group here. So 93% understands it to be a framework for an economy that is restorative and regenerative by design. Spot on. That is indeed what we're speaking about. So well done. So next question. Illinois is active in transitioning to a circular economy. Hopefully you can see that second question up there. Not sure that you can see it. Can I get a thumbs up from my fellow panelists? If it's up there, I don't see it on my end. There it is. Thank you. It looks like it's the first one again. So the second one.
Sorry, technical difficulties. Just
okay.
A moment. Here we go.
That is quite all right. There we go. So is Illinois active in transitioning to a circular economy? From your understanding, from what you've observed, no right or wrong answer here. So yes, no, or unsure. And again, no right or wrong. Just curious to what you are seeing and hearing and maybe even participating in. All right, let's see our responses, please. It looks like kind of a mixed bag. Yes, about a quarter of us believe that yes, Illinois is active in transitioning. No, almost 40% and 40% unsure. And that is quite all right. We do hope by the end of this conversation, you'll be able to have a better understanding and spot the ways that Illinois might be active in transitioning to a circular economy, and also spot ways of which you can contribute to that transition and help usher the progress along. So now that we got that kind of cleared and got that bit of level setting out the way, let's do a little bit more level setting. When we speak about circular economy, again, just want to reiterate that we're not speaking about plastics and we're not speaking about recycling as we know it. While there are some benefits, obviously, to recycling and to those dynamics, there are tons of flaws and tons of inconsistencies in the recycling space. So again, what we are speaking about is the comprehensive and dynamic economic model that has restoration and regeneration at its core. So in our current economic model, I'm going to use very technical terms here. One where we take stuff from the earth to make a thing, we use the thing, and then we waste the thing. So that's my technical definition of, my technical explanation of the linear model. One of the biggest challenges with this model is that obviously our natural resources are finite. So our earth can only give and withstand but so much. But in a circular economic model, what we're speaking about is designing out waste from the very beginning and activating circular business models, which aren't entirely new concepts. But with these business models, it again allows for waste to be designed out from the very beginning. So the 3 that we're focused on here for the purposes of our conversation are product life extension, sharing platforms, and products and services. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with these 3, but I'll just do a brief explanation just so that we're all on the same page. So when we speak about product life extension, we're thinking repair and reuse, secondhand selling, replacement of components of our devices rather than replacing the entire device and so on. When we talk about sharing platforms, we're talking about renting or sharing what's needed. You know, there's very popular rideshare services such as Lyft and Uber, and you have Airbnb and those type of platforms. And then for the last one, this is the one that I get very excited about. It's very fascinating, and that's products as services. So think of customers, or think of you buying solutions to your problem rather than buying the thing that solves your problem. So one of the very prominent examples is with Philips Lighting Company. So rather than continue to sell lighting devices, Philips started to sell the light. Very fascinating. I encourage you to explore. So one of the things that stands out to me in each of those three business models is the presence of innovation. And one of the other things that stands out to me, and you'll see as we go deeper into the evolution of a circular economy, is that with linear economy, there are often entire swaths of communities and populations that are negatively impacted by the continuation of that take, make, waste model. And then when we talk about transitioning to a circular economy, there are entire swaths of communities and populations that are left out of those innovative business models that I've just described. So in that context, let's talk about what an inclusive circular economy looks like for a given geography, city, or community. And two of the main aspects that we'll touch on are the inclusion of marginalized communities and the necessity of policy change. So when we speak about economic models, usually in the same sentence with marginalized communities, I often hear the default of job creation, right? We create jobs, marginalized communities, the economy is improved. And while yes, new jobs that are created within a circular framework are critical, the biggest differentiator is that the ownership of the jobs that are created and the inclusion of the communities in the design and innovation process occur from the very beginning. So the circular economy does not happen to citizens of XYZ community, but it can only effectively happen with and through the citizens of XYZ community. And when we speak of policy change, we're referencing the necessity for incentives and accountabilities at the city, state, and federal level to enable the transition to a fully inclusive and circular economic model. And that may mean some undoing of the existing policies and practices to allow for new ones. Okay, enough of me speaking. I'm done. I would love for you to hear from our panelists. And again, as Lisa mentioned, as we have this conversation, we really want to ensure it is a conversation. So if there's anything that sparks a question in your mind as you hear from the panelists, please do drop it in the Q&A function. And Lisa will be our co-host, and she'll jump in and share some of those questions as we go along the conversation. All right, so let's turn it over to Jonathan. I'd like to start with you, Jonathan. Let's talk a bit about economic mobility and environmental justice. Why do we need to consider a new economic model here and now? What would you say to that? And you're on mute, Jonathan.
It can be. There's always, I'm on a slight delay here, I think. I'm trying to get there. Okay, big question. I start with coming from it. It sounds like this audience is well cued into the basic conceit of a circular economy, and the majority of the conversation around circular economy typically focuses on materials and nutrients, right? Whether those are biological or technical nutrients, right? What we tend to forget is the factor of people in there. So when we talk about regenerative, is understanding how extractive our economy can be with people and labor and knowledge. So it's not just about the fact that our linear economic system is very much based on extracting resources and then using those up. But we've extracted cheap and free labor for centuries. We've built our economy was based on hundreds of years of free slave labor. And then some of that continues today, free and cheap labor. Even if we're outsourcing, in the United States, we're often relying on below minimum wage labor in our food industry. And we are relying on cheaper free, slave labor from overseas as well. Anytime you're getting a cheap product to consume, you have to think about why it's cheap. And typically it's cheap because someone else has suffered as a result of it, or an environment has suffered. So, the way play in Chicago, we view the circular economy as that we're operating at a local level, and when you operate at a local level, people become much more evident. We're dealing with people every day. I'd also say too, another thing to really remember is that, again, circular economy is not new. The name is certainly relatively new, but we've been practicing it for millennia, and many parts of the world have been practicing it already. So it can come across as incredibly insulting if we're looking at various populations, like if you're going to Cuba or India or even many parts of Chicago, they're saying, hey, you all should implement the circular economy. Meanwhile, they're repairing all of their electronics. They're, like minimizing the amount of waste out of necessity, sourcing local. So these are two things that often get lost in the broader circular economy conversation. And to go back to your point, you touched on this, but recycling is certainly a part of circular economy, but it's the least value. So when we talk about single-use products, businesses and individuals to think upstream. How much are they sourcing? What are they sourcing? We're very familiar, two of the biggest, sort of environmental controversies right now in Chicago are recycling, or projects that deal with asphalt and steel recycling, and negative environmental impacts that can come out of that. So we do have to be very aware that, we've been trained both by recycling, the industry that produces single use, the recycling industry and environmentalists for many decades, that recycling is like the answer to our problems. And we're very aware, especially with plastic right now, that it is not. We're anywhere at tops, we're at 14% of global single-use plastic. Like that's the top potential amount that we're recycling. It's just, we're not going to get there. We cannot keep up with the amount we're producing. So it really has to come down to business models that are not relying on new resources, and using recycling as an excuse, or like your get out of jail free card for being like, well, I made a recyclable product. Businesses really have to be on the hook for figuring out models for taking care of what they're producing, making sure that there is another use, or that it can be recycled. So I put a lot out there already.
If I can,
go, Peter.
You touched on a lot of great points, but one thing that comes to mind is the sort of myth of recycling, right? Like businesses say, I made a recyclable product, but what often you find is that it's not truly recyclable, particularly within a community context. Take, for example, PS6, polystyrene 6. It looks like what we used to call styrofoam, right? It is technically recyclable, but you need to go to a very specialized facility. Those facilities are often hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles apart from one another. And generally then it ends up in a landfill. So that's just like one small example that I've been trying to deal with in a very acute manner. So I just wanted to kind of hop in on that and didn't mean to interrupt any flow, but.
No, that's perfect. You actually touched on one of the things that I was going to touch on is that, from the consumer standpoint, we're often encouraged, by our local municipalities to recycle. Well, my municipality has a very different, ability to handle an infrastructure to handle certain materials than the one that might be the next township over or the next, section over. So from the consumer standpoint, it's very confusing. And we feel like we're doing something good, but then like you say, Peter, it ends up in the landfill and it's really not any good. But Jonathan, you did say one thing that I wanted to come back to. I really appreciate where you were going from the human element of it, the human aspect that is often, again, overlooked when we talk about all things recycle or circular economy. So can you talk to us a little bit about, and also when you were talking about, kind of injustices with workers and wages, that kind of thing. I went to environmental justice. So can you talk a little bit about that and how a circular economy addresses issues of environmental injustices?
So I don't know if it does enough yet. And that's I think that is a legitimate criticism of circular economy, is that when you just focus on materials, you forget the people, right? So you can still create a system where you got like close to 100%. We're never at 100% efficiency. We know that. But when you're getting close to it, where the materials are being exchanged with just a few players, right? You could extract all of those rare earth metals out of China, and they're circulating in North America, right? Amongst a few people, or there's only a few people at the top of these really large companies that are seeing the wealth and the benefits, right? So I'll come back to the benefits as well. So I did I think when we had a call for this, I talked about, hey, around the corner from my office, there are 4 stores on the commercial strip that are appliance repair stores. I did a Google search, again, and there's actually 9 places along this corridor. And if you look around the city, there are certain parts of the city where repair and reuse, the sort of those kind of core circular economy businesses are already happening, right? They're happening in communities that we call marginalized communities and low-income communities. So I think we're at a point where and you said this earlier, we're not talking about circular economy to communities. It's with and building up those communities what we had, when you look at that number of businesses, we actually have a circular economy corridor here. No one's calling it that, but there are businesses that are the paradigm, the prototypical circular economy businesses that are not being acknowledged as such. So,
yeah.
The other part of it too, we're often talking about the companies that are really engaging in it are, we have this economy that created this problem, right? This consumptive business models that are built on just consuming more, whether you need it or not. How do we convince people to buy more of our material product? And now retroactively saying, oh my God, this is creating global problems here. We need to refigure it out. But we can look to these other smaller businesses, especially in developing countries, as models for engaging in circular economies.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. And that's actually a good segue, Sabira. I'd like to hear from you because you have quite a bit of experience in other places around the world as it relates to, what these models have looked like in action. So can you speak a little bit about that, what you've seen in practice?
Yeah, I would love to talk about the environmental justice piece that Jonathan was just talking about. Is that in India, I previously worked in India before working at Reaply, and I was at a social enterprise waste management company. And what we saw is that informal recycling is pervasive throughout the country. And that's because the economics kind of drive that and support that. There is value for some materials because there's demand for some materials that get recycled. And so people kind of like living and working off of the streets are hauling all these materials and aggregating them and processing them, but they're doing it, in poor labor standards, kind of month to month, day to day, with not even real roofs over their heads and just getting by. And that's because there's kind of a lack of willingness to pay for that processing and the handling and processing to actually get to the recycling and waste management infrastructure. And what we found was that if there is a willingness to shift that mindset, if there's policy either at a municipality level or a country level, that then large corporations that are the extractors in that society start to behave in a way that compensates for that value that they're providing and formalizing that system. So you see then we're able to groom and train an entrepreneur to be a more formal scrap dealer. And that's not a ton of investment. More formal scrap dealer means he has a laptop and a conveyor belt instead of having women manually sort through thousands of pounds of waste per month. So there's definitely the ability to shift that and change that. And because the situation that they're kind of facing prior to formalization is there's burning of plastic, you're inhaling kind of like all these materials that nobody's wearing PPE. So definitely even the just the compensation for the value of that work, there's a huge opportunity to move the needle just in kind of like that small realm of recycling, or the least valuable realm of recycling. And then as you go more and more upstream, repair, remanufacturing, those are a lot of those operations are informal as well, and they're formalizing those and actually compensating for the value, I think, would drive a change.
Excellent, thank you. Peter or Jonathan, anything to add to what Sabira, or respond to what Sabira mentioned?
I would just add on to it. We spent so much time in Chicago talking about how do we increase our recycling rate. It's under 10, 11, 10, 9, 8, depending on which year percent. But the question is really, like, if we increase the recycling rate, how is that going to improve the life of our marginalized communities? Does it have an impact? These places in the world, right? Are we going to set up a system where, yeah, there's informal, garbage pickers and people that are not making a living wage, but we've increased our recycling rate? Or are we going to install a system, that actually is providing benefit, and we're not just putting the increase in recycling rate again on the backs of undervalued labor?
Right. That's a good segue to Peter. Want to hear from you. Sabira talked about policy. Jonathan talked about systems. You with NL, NL does a lot, in this space in helping cities convert around the world. So you've seen a lot, and you are, directly involved in a lot. So what are you seeing? What systemic shifts need to happen? What should be considered toward a city evolving toward a more circular economy comprehensively?
Well, I think first and foremost, it starts, and I try to start any conversation about circular economy with the design phase, right? And the ultimate goal is regeneration. So I want to shift away from the materials discussion for a little bit and talk about policy, because policy is critically important. And NL has been very active in the space for several years. We are a partner to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Just a little bit more on the company, since probably nobody's heard of us. We operate in over 30 countries. We have enough transmission and distribution lines to run from the Earth to the moon 4 times. And we are also the largest producer of renewable energy in the world. And what we really seek to do is provide, our purpose is open power for a brighter future. And we empower sustainable progress. So we don't want to sell you a product necessarily, right? And we see that open, inclusive need for electricity access, for example, in certain parts of the world, electricity reliability, but also that as an opportunity. And so one of the things that we focused on with cities is that, within the next, I think it's 20 years, 2/3 or more of the world's population is going to live in cities. 75% of the world's energy is consumed within cities, and 80% of its economic value is within cities. And so we know that it's a critical area that we have to focus on. And because of that, we've published multiple papers on circular cities, and the cities of tomorrow, we call it, where we published our 3rd edition. And the most recent edition focused on where to place the control room, right? Because we know that a transition to a circular economy has to be inclusive. It has to be cross collaboration, public sector, private sector, academia, research, everybody has to be at the table. A lot of people sometimes ask me, what does an energy company care about circular economy? Well, there's an economic opportunity there. But I think back to my education, which was in economics. And the first thing you learn in econ is it is the efficient allocation of finite resources, and resources are finite. And so what's the opposite of sustainable? It's unsustainable. And so you have to work as a system, across the value chain. So Jonathan mentioned earlier, it mainly focuses on materials, but businesses need to start from the design phase, and cities, communities need to as well. So where do I put that control room? Do I want it to be a silo in the public works department? Well, you're not maybe going to have as much effect. Do I want it to be managed by the mayor's office, but then there's accountability through other functions without the government? Or do I want it to be something of a hybrid where we've also brought industry players, we've brought community members to the table, and we're looking at all of these systems holistically? In energy space, we've heard a lot more about the food, energy, health nexus, right? And so one of the things that we've been working on is looking at dual land use. If we want to achieve renewable energy goals, it's going to take something like 1.8 million acres in the next 10 years to meet those growth targets. Well, how do we couple that with agriculture or pollinator-friendly ecosystem services to provide better outcomes and also improve the livelihoods of the communities where we're operating? That's partly why social inclusivity, social justice, and the human aspect of the circular economy is critical to NL, because we develop power generation assets. We develop large, long-standing infrastructure projects that are going to exist for decades and decades, and we want that to be truly sustainable. It's not enough for us that it's a renewable energy asset, right? We want to produce jobs for the community. We want to help the community address their needs and create shared value in a way that improves the collective impact of what our business is providing the world.
Excellent, thank you. Jonathan or Sabir, before I go to my next question, piggybacking off of Peter, anything that you want to add? No? So Peter, you started to mention a little bit about roles, and you started to talk about how it really does take all hands on deck, if you will, approach, that there is a role or responsibility for everyone, every organization at every level. So from your perspective, what do you think is the role of nonprofits or the social sector? When we talked a little bit about policy, you talked a little bit about companies, but what about nonprofits? What about education? Can you go a little deeper in that?
Yeah, I mean, we have hundreds of community partners in the US and in Canada for North America, and it is all of the above. It is sort of, I would say, at times being the voice of the voiceless, being a convening partner for communities. I mean, oftentimes where we're developing, we don't have a big office building nearby, right? So we don't want to enter a community and say, this is what you need. We need voices. We need convening bodies to really coordinate those in-between spaces, right? And we try to listen very closely to what communities are telling us. And education is obviously critical as well. I think nonprofits for the private sector bring an additional level of credibility to the work that is being done if it's done in earnest. And they also have the opportunity to call BS if it's not really credible, right? And I think that that's important to keep business honest, and also to keep government honest, right? I mean, we as a private company can advocate for certain policy changes and things like environmental product declarations or extended producer responsibility and increased recycling infrastructure, but we are inherently perceived to have some sort of self-interest in mind, whereas nonprofits, I think the profit motive is taken out of it, but the profit is translated into positive externalities, right? And I remember hearing recently even a discussion from the gentleman who I believe started the AIDS Walk, which raises hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and he said, I don't even like the term nonprofit, because it sort of denotes that there is not this inherent benefit to what the sector is doing, and it should be something like mutual profit or collective profit, right? Because I think that's really what the sector provides, and they can offer that guidance to both government entities, community partners, and the private sector.
Yes, I agree 100% with that gentleman. Nonprofit is a tax status. It does not have anything to do with value or work or production or anything. So Jonathan, Sabira, what gaps do you see? So when we talk about the different roles that sectors need to play, what's missing? Why? What do you think the prohibitors are, or the roadblocks? Why isn't there a massive collective movement? We see it happening in the EU in different ways. So what is it that's missing here in the States, and what do you think those barriers are?
Well, I definitely think the policy progressiveness of the EU definitely surpasses where we are in the US by a lot. I'm not a policy expert, but I think the thing to think about, that what goes underneath all of successful policy is rethinking systems. And that's really a complicated, challenging system overhaul approach that has a lot of players and stakeholders involved. And you need to rethink technology, you need to rethink infrastructure, economics, human behavior, institutional relationships, and all of those things kind of combined would move our large ship by a couple of degrees, and we can avoid crashing into the iceberg, but we are not at that point where in this country we have the policy to kind of enable it. So the gap is now with, or the opportunity is with institutions of all shapes and sizes, from small businesses to large businesses, or universities, nonprofits, all of them, to kind of rethink what their role is. We have to also look at ourselves, and are we actually properly measuring success for ourselves and our society? So once you can kind of take a hard look at what we're driving towards, you as an individual organization, you as an individual, you as an organization, and then collectively, I think that's the gap, is we really have to rethink what we're heading towards, and then all of us swimming in the same direction will get some momentum. But it's a huge and like overwhelming, intimidating lift.
Well, one thing on the policy front, and NL is in our headquarters globally is in Rome. We are a European company, obviously, and Italy, as an example, is on its 4th or 5th policy iteration around circular economy. And as part of the EU Green New Deal, they are developing a comprehensive framework, right? They are working together, and there's collaboration involved in that. There's also some compromise involved in that, and we don't see much of that on the political sphere at the national level in the US. And also, I think the US being so large geographically, that there's all this fragmentation, right? So Renee, you touched upon recycling, access and rules and whatnot at a hyper local level. The energy system within the United States is hyper fragmented as well, and has different rules of operating. And so, to the extent that all those various stakeholders that Sabira talked about can come to the table, but then it needs to be comprehensive, right? And you have to put the onus back on those who are extracting, right, to change their behavior. There has to be some incentivizing of that, right? Whether it's tax breaks or whatever else. There has to be some financing mechanisms by which that can be perceived. But then there also has to be penalties on the flip side, right? It's carrot and stick. But everybody has to come to the table and reach, number one, a firm agreement on what's trying to be achieved. And then from there, you can drill down to sort of what level it's going to be most effective to coordinate action.
I'd add to that, we have a tendency in the US to think of it like environmentalism from very much like a punishment or an anti-economic standpoint. And like every agency is like focused on enforcing rules, stopping, punishing polluter, or they should be. That's their stated purpose. Whether they do it or not is another thing. But it is the economic opportunity, right? So circular, and that is the huge benefit of thinking about circular economy, is that we are forefronting the economy that is inclusive, that's regenerative, and the more we can tie that together, that sustainability is the economic engine, and that has to be for the future, instead of these bygone, we tackle the fossil fuel industry because it's a paradigm of extraction. We're taking things out of the earth. Even if you take climate change out of it, it's a finite resource that we're not making more, store billions of years of stored solar energy in the earth. We don't make that again.
But Jonathan, at the same time in the US, that is a heavily subsidized industry, right? So somewhere along the lines, people change the narrative to be, we have to create these jobs in this space or protect these resources that we can capitalize on, and it's highly subsidized. Whereas, as you said, regulations for the environment are perceived to be a negative. Two kind of points on that. Number one, Scotland's EPA is a great example of trying to change that paradigm. I actually just learned this from John Elkington, who's a sort of sustainability thought leader, recently, that they are trying to change the perception of their organization as well as what their activities are, from being a regulator to being an enabler. So implementing things like think tanks, innovation hubs, challenges, and things that are going to spark people to come to the table as participants that might otherwise have not been, and also to drive that change in a way that has a positive perception. And you mentioned sustainability is the economic opportunity. For the energy sector, Jean-Marc Ollinger, who is a sort of thought leader at Accenture on circular economy, said that of the $2.7 trillion electricity industry globally, $500 billion of value is at risk over the next decade if the sector doesn't embrace the circular economy. And so if you're a private sector player, you see that opportunity. Waste is inherently, missing out on the opportunity. But there is economic incentives, and the way that the policies work need to be able to incentivize that for those who feel they don't have a stake in the game right now, and for those that we know are going to be critical players in the transition.
Excellent. I love that. I'm going to pause here for a moment, and I jotted down regulator to enabler. I like that. I do have a question around your thoughts on our new administration that we have in office now, what their, kind of policies or where they're trending or where they're heading, what that means for the circular economy space. But before I ask that question, I think we do have a few questions from the audience. So Lisa, did you want to share some of the questions that came through?
We do. Thanks, Renee, and thanks for folks who are contributing their questions already. So we have a couple that I think are related and maybe tie into the conversation that you've been having so far. So I'll throw them out there and see if there's anything that you wanted to add in these in this arena. One person asks, how do you create buy-in from the masses that do not prioritize a circular mindset? And I think a related question from another person says, our economy consists of selling more stuff and hence infinitely growing revenues. And I think several of you have touched on this already. How can circular principles help us think beyond this simplistic metric? Anything else that you'd add in addition to what you've already shared?
Peter, Jonathan.
I can share a little bit about Reaply, what we've been able to see in practice. So we sell a technology platform that enables organizations to create digital visibility of the assets that they are generally underutilized or headed to landfill so that they can be reused within the organization. And if not, then sharing with other organizations in and around their area. And what we're able to see is that what convinces people who might not be thinking about circular economy in the way that we're talking about it here today, making the different cases to them and in kind of amalgamation, they start to change their mind. So we make the economic case that by reusing, you are avoiding the purchase of a new asset, unnecessarily double buying. You are delaying the cost to dispose of something. That is, you as a procurement leader, a supply chain leader, that's important to you because it hits your bottom line. If you're the sustainability or environmental person at the table and we're making the case, well, this is going to be the carbon impact for your company, helping you move towards your ESG goals. And so kind of having like a multi-pronged approach to people that are not believers and showing them how simple, well, not simple, but small changes to their what they expect to happen in normal life and making a technology change, a different user journey for themselves isn't going to shatter their world. That's a really great way to start to get buy-in. And I think to the kind of the second question, reuse in itself is a way to start. We're scratching the surface, but it is a way to start delaying and moving away from as extractive of situations that we've had since the beginning of capitalism.
If I can build off of that, I think there's the concept of, yes, demonstrating the value, absolutely, but also what we all need to do, whether it's governments and the EU is working on this in form of legislation and defined metrics, or corporations or communities, is defining data on what it means, right? Like for NL as an example, we beginning last year, we started presenting on a quarterly basis. Every global business line in every country presents on a quarterly basis to our group level CEO all of our circular economy initiatives. And with that, we have to define what the industrial and environmental key performance indicators are, as well as what the economic indicators are. And so number one, reporting to the C-suite on that as the second slide after health and safety is a clear signal that we mean business and we're serious about this. Number two, it gets a lot of buy-in. Number three, it demonstrates that value. But I think the Ellen MacArthur principles are sort of nebulous to people, and they do need some translating to practical actions that you can take. And to the extent that data can support that, I think it's super helpful. And to the extent that you can demonstrate it both environmentally and economically, or with social indicators around job creation or stakeholder engagement, all of those things can really do a lot to change people's minds.
Thanks. So we have another question that I think kind of builds on this when it comes to the question of buy-in. Angela says, how do we develop coalitions that are inclusive of organizations, businesses, and institutions at all levels, from community level to city, state, and national? As a small community center in Chicago, we are reorienting our mission to be inclusive of circular design principles, equitable treatment, compensation, access, et cetera, in terms of business practices, program content, and strategic vision, but I feel like we're going at it alone. We can't afford experts, but we need solidarity efforts and broader support around these ideas. We also yearn to educate our community on the importance of movement in this direction and are working to identify our starting point. Any thoughts that you'd share with Angela?
Thank you, Angela, for that question. A very comprehensive question. Jonathan, did you want to take that? Do you want to talk a little bit about the Circular Chicago Coalition and kind of how that's taken shape? I think that's a nice tie-in to talk about, it is so dynamic and folks from so many different sectors are part of it. So you want to speak a bit about that?
Yeah, I can only speak out from a part of it, from Plant Chicago's perspective, but Plant Chicago and Pixera and Repley and more organizations have been having this conversation around treating Chicago as a circular, like Chicago being primed for paradigm of a circular city, in particular with a focus on this conversation around marginalized community, building up from within what exists, and making sure that circularity is an engine for inclusive economic opportunity. How do you build coalitions and that are inclusive at all levels? That's a really great, difficult question. I think, Angela, it looks like maybe you're from Hyde Park Neighborhood Center. When you talk about all the different levels of organizations and how small do you go, how big and mid-level, I don't have an answer. I think the goal is to have as much diversity in all the senses as possible, but also recognizing that there are organizations that are going to buy in with their time and thought and leadership around that, and everybody, no one, or I run a nonprofit, we're limited by what we can do, right? For-profits have boundaries as well, and the government helps set the framework for us to be successful. So all three sectors have to be engaged in this, and definitely we need some legislative leadership for sure, some government, even if it's setting goals, that if that's not there, businesses can only do so much, right?
If I could add to that, I would say, kudos to the position that you want to take in being more inclusive and looking at circular design. Share that, right? Have a position, have a take, and also, because we know it takes a village, so to speak. And the other thing I would encourage people to say is don't be scared to share your challenges or your failures. Within NL, they use a portmanteau, or two words combined as one, called innovability, and that's where we really marry innovation and sustainability, and we provide online what we call open innovation challenges, and they are literally open to anyone. Someone listening to this webinar could go online to Open Innovability at NL and look up the challenges, and that tells you what we're trying to solve for, right? And to the extent that you will find other people that are looking at the same challenges, and you may also find people that say, hey, you know what, we had that problem, but we solved it, or we might not have solved it, but we know these other folks over here who are doing some really cool work, and maybe we can all start to collaborate. I think, it all starts with conversation and having a position, and then getting engaged, and not being afraid to share big, bold ideas, big, bold challenges.
Yes, and I would echo Peter and Jonathan. Actually, when we think about the Chicago Coalition, it is comprehensive, it is complex, and it's been a long time in the making. I think this has been a couple year quest conversation to really build the relationships, understand who's doing what, understand who's really in it, for the journey, and who's willing to contribute. And so far, it's landed at kind of a 4-tiered coalition, if you will. There's convening partners, there's knowledge partners, there's inclusive education partners, and then there's community partners. So I say that to say that everyone has something to contribute, and everyone is able to do, as much or as little, as they want to do. So Angela, again, thank you for asking that question, and we invite you to consider, being a part of the Chicago Coalition, because it does take everyone, it does take all of us at whatever level we are in.
Renee, can I just add to that too? Well, it's been like a multi-year conversation. It's still very much at the beginning.
It is,
and it's not representative of the whole city of Chicago yet, by any means.
Very important.
By any means.
Yeah.
So there are other nonprofits and folks in the city that are doing great work as well. We collaborate. I'm just thinking right now, I think they might even be on the call, but like Chicago Creative Reuse Exchange on the South Side, the Chicago Tool Library, folks that are actually, working to divert materials from the landfill right now. So there's a whole host, and then other community, environmental justice organizations as well. So we're at the beginning.
Exactly why.
It's not like, hey, we're done. Circular economies are like democracy. They only work with active engagement at all times. Exactly. You never get to a perfect state. So
exactly. And thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that. And I think that's part of the reason for this conversation, is because we know that there are so many voices that have not been part of it yet. And so this is our way of saying, hey, this is what we're working on over here. Who else might be interested, to Peter's point of kind of talking about it and putting it out there. So this is our representation of that.
I think we see, we talked a bit about business models, sharing the examples you mentioned, Renee, I would call sharing platforms. They're perhaps not like the fundamental sharing of one conveyor belt and 5 processors using the same thing. But we're seeing other business models, at least in the energy industry, that can really bring people to the table, which is part of why we got involved in the Circular Chicago Coalition. We see the energy grid in the US becoming more distributed in terms of rooftop solar, utility solar, battery storage, home residential storage, and that creates opportunities for a lot of those people that might not have traditionally had a seat at the table. And what I would call a prosumer model, where you can aggregate demand and contribute to grid resiliency at the same time earning a bit of revenue to pay back for those systems, or financing models coming from companies or from banks that want to make community investments, right? And so those types of things really kind of change the paradigm from the traditional person saying, I need power in my house, I'm going to call up one company, they're going to send me a bill every month, to no, you can play a different role, and the same can go for your business, for your nonprofit, for your school district. We did a project a couple of years ago at Marcus Garvey Village in Brooklyn, which is an affordable housing community. Project was 100% financed. They have solar panels, they have battery storage. They bid into what's called an energy capacity market, and then they get paid for that to reduce their energy. So it produces efficient, clean energy, adds grid resilience, and the everyday local consumer who otherwise wouldn't have had a seat at the table can earn a little bit of revenue on that. It's all the business models, I think, are really starting to change the way that large corporations interact with startups, with nonprofits interacting with innovation hubs, and of course, the role that government has to play in helping parse all of that out.
Excellent. That's a fascinating model, an example that you gave there, Peter. Thank you for sharing that. I got excited when you first told me about that, and even more excited now hearing it again. Lisa, it sounds like we have a few more questions that came in. Did you want to share?
We do. So there, Tessa actually shared a comment. Tessa says, I've had similar thoughts to Angela's regarding having collectives, coalitions, groups like chambers of commerce for organizations working in the circular or alternative economy space to have a common voice. The concept of chambers of commons versus commerce is something that was started and abandoned in Chicago, and it's an interesting concept. So something maybe to throw into the mix. Thanks, Tessa. And then we do have a couple of other questions. One, Molly asks, how has COVID spurred the development of circular economies in the Chicago area or not? Are there opportunities that this current moment presents that you all are seeing?
Jonathan or Sabira, did you want to take that one?
Jonathan, go ahead. I can go after.
Sure, I'll take Tessa's because it's a time for a shameless plug. Tessa at the Chicago Tool Library, we're doing a tool swap event this Saturday. I love the idea of a Chamber of Commons, and I just say all these questions, these how questions of how do we do this. It's fun. It's finding the mind space and I don't know, space in your life and soul, I guess, to like figure out how you're going to spend your time. And like forums like this reinvigorate me, for example. So having these conversations, any kind of systemic change, policy change is really difficult, takes years. And so just like the sustained work of organizations, I think help keep it going, having these conversations. But I don't have an answer for it. I don't know if anybody else can add to it as well, but Sabrina, I think you were gonna take a stab at one of those two.
I was going to take a stab at what's happening with COVID. So Peter,
Oh,
if
yeah.
you want.
No. I was pointing at you on the screen because I know Ripley has an awesome story about it.
So what we were able to contribute, or at least maybe alleviate some pain during right after COVID began, was we launched a Chicago PPE marketplace. So what was really interesting is that we were geographically focused and partnered with the city to launch a place where suppliers and buyers of PPE could come to the table and transact. And, that created lower cost, easy, like more transparency, kind of knowing who's on the other side, while also kind of democratizing access to PPE when we thought that there was going to be a bottleneck in the supply chain. And so, we had thousands of transactions and businesses come on board. And that really, showed the value of connecting people, right? Is behind the PPE are the people that are standing up emergency systems and being able to use technology to create those connections and maintain them. And what we've even seen afterwards, I mean, we put a pause on that actual marketplace, but that technology in itself, we've thought about actually revisiting with the city of Chicago and partnering with Black and Brown business owners to see if that technology might be useful to them to connect with each other and create a business to business platform for them to transact with each other and work with each other and bring digital visibility to their businesses online as well. So exciting stuff happening in Chicago, and COVID was kind of the spur of that, which was really great.
And
excellent.
If I can just jump in one last comment, Renee,
Yeah.
I think we have to acknowledge that COVID turned the world on its ear, right? And in the short term, there was a lot of concern about circular transition during COVID because those concepts of sharing and platforms were sort of at risk. And you had local municipalities saying you have to use single bags for takeout. You cannot use your reusable shopping bag. You have to use this takeout equipment. But as we learn more about the virus and how it gets spread and everything else, most of you have probably heard of this mantra of build back better. And there's now an opportunity because when you are able to, and I saw there was a question about supply chains. I'm happy to follow up offline or if we want to talk about that, but it also COVID disrupted supply chains and all aspects of material movement and business travel. And so to the extent that circularity would strengthen value chains by closing the loop and being tighter in smaller circles in the Ellen MacArthur language, then communities can use that as an opportunity to become more resilient and to really strengthen those ties, strengthen that cross-industry collaboration, and look to those people that might be right next door, but you weren't necessarily talking to in the past, as Sabira said, right? And so teaser, we have a position paper coming out for North America on circular economy next month. And the focus of it is really on recovery, resiliency, and regeneration. And so keep your eyes out for that, but yeah.
Great, thank you for that, Peter. Lisa, did we have any other questions coming through?
We do. We have a couple. We have a comment related to this current topic. Barbara points out that sharing and mutual aid have surfaced, or a light has been shown on them more during COVID, slowing down, doing things at home. She says will hopefully spur more conversations about what part of this we want to develop as a society, and that we can and should be part of those conversations. Thanks, Barbara. So a couple of questions then around sort of how folks can get involved. And then Peter, I want to get back to this question about the supply chain as well. That's thank you for your patience to the person who submitted that question a few minutes ago. So generally speaking, we have a question about what are initiatives or organizations that private citizens can get involved in to be part of the local movement here in Chicago. And Vicki asks if you could speak briefly about efforts in collar counties or other parts of Illinois. So just anything that any of you all would like to share about how to get involved in the movement that's happening currently, and how folks might be thinking about either getting involved in existing movements or creating their own movements in the areas that they live in.
Anyone want to take that one? Excuse me.
I want to just first piggyback off of Barbara's comment. Now is a great time. We're very hyper aware of what waste we're generating. Everybody working at home, and you're like, I'm putting a lot of plastic and trash. Now's a great time to do a waste audit and actually weigh all your stuff going out the door. We have a little our staff is doing a waste audit of us ourselves right now, and challenge anyone right now to join us and do that and just spend a week and weigh everything. Some things like locally, so Plant Chicago, where we are right now, we basically just started accepting like food scraps from our neighbors, and then shipping those off we're partnering with Urban Canopy to make sure that those get composted as an initiative. So in some ways, it's just like our perspective is just start doing stuff and like see what sticks. Organics are very much, we focus a lot on organics because Chicago has not had a sort of collective initiative around organics collection. It's a epitome of a hyper-local economic activity as well. There's a lot of opportunity there and people doing it. So focusing on organics over like recycling and plastic is always something that I feel like is a lot more inspiring for folks and very tangible, because it happens at a hyper-local basis. We have where that plastic goes and where that recycled content goes and how many places it stops and how it gets processed is a mystery, and kind of to many people as well. It's because you don't see it. So I'd say just starting something and seeing if you can do it sometimes, and working with your neighbors or finding some other partners who are going to buy into what you're doing.
And Peter and Sabira, before I ask you to address that question, I do encourage folks to enter your ideas in the chat, share with each other. If you know of things that are happening in your neighborhood or, across the city or state, please do share. Definitely not a one-sided conversation here. Please do share with each other. So Peter, Sabira, do you have anything to add to that, to what Jonathan shared?
Yeah, well, I'll defer to Sabira as Repley is an Illinois-based company. I can talk to our assets in Illinois, which are in other locations, but I'll defer to her on the Illinois point. And then I did have a note, as Jonathan also mentioned, Barbara's comment on COVID and being at home. But.
Well, I would say I would actually say that your place of work is an amazing way to have an influence and an impact. So we see buyers of Reaply are not necessarily, just procurement specialists. A lab manager who wants to better utilize assets in a lab, somebody who works in a university setting who can see the use of sharing space and their own, like we've heard dancers wanting to share costumes and shoes with each other, architecture students. The ability to share anything and every is possible with the right technology and system. So I would advocate to like look around just as much as a waste audit is an excellent way to understand like what you're doing today, doing the same and pushing for the same at your workplace, and asking people who might have purchasing power to turn to technologies like Reaply to help, or even just trying things, prototyping on your own and saying, I have this thing I'm not using. Can I share or can I get it refurbished and therefore use it better? Those decisions, when they start adding up and snowballing, you get an organization sharing all of its assets across all of its locations across the globe, and then you get a real movement.
And not just an organization, but a community too, right? I think, Renee, you had mentioned product as a service earlier on. I was reminded by a quote from a former Black & Decker executive who said, people don't want to buy a drill, they want to buy they want a hole in their wall, right? And at a hyper local neighborhood type level, Uber, Uber is a sharing platform to some extent, but I don't see it as truly sharing the same way of your neighbor asking, can I borrow your car, right? Like Uber is going out and leasing vehicles to people to then go drive around like taxis. I see that as fundamentally different, right? But there are other sharing platforms where there are so many assets in our lives that are underutilized that can create small to moderate economic opportunities for people and also stem the need for more stuff, right? So I'd add to that, but back to Barbara's point, she mentioned being at home, the concept of mutual aid, and what came to mind is, number one, we learned in the pandemic, like, quote unquote, I don't want to say who matters as if anybody doesn't matter, but we noted the underrepresentation of who we now know are critical employees, people working at your local grocery stores, working, not just EMTs in hospitals, but other services that we need to provide, and taking into consideration what aspects of this new reality means to them, and also how we can address it through circular models. So one thing that became really apparent, and we talk about open power at Enel, in other parts of the world, we also talk about open broadband and how, access to platforms is vital to facilitate the type of stuff that Sabira and Reaply are doing, right? Access to information. But even in the US, rural parts of the US, people don't have high-speed internet, right? And we need to kind of change that paradigm model. And so we see a lot of opportunity there to build off of platformization, right? Because when things aren't connected, it's a lot harder to fit the pieces of the puzzle together, if that makes sense. There was something on supply chain. I don't know if we wanted to address that now or if there was another topic. We've only got like 6 minutes left.
I just a couple of things to address the comment with what's happening in Collar. I know Barbara did mention Scarce, another nonprofit, but thinking about building materials depots as well, the reuse depot in Maywood, and then on the north side of Chicago, Rebuilding Exchange, who also combines some workforce training with their work as well. So some places to look for resources.
Perfect. Thank you. And Peter, I don't see that question on supply chain. If you see it, do you want to go ahead and address it?
I believe it was, and Lisa pointed out, very patiently waited for, there was a question around how to engage, say, tier one suppliers and in a multi-stage value chain, how to go about that. And I think, in the example of an automaker, if I'm the automaker, my tier one supplier is the person who asked the question, right, about producing seats. But their tier one supplier is the person producing the foam, so to speak. And so it does need to be cross-industry collaboration. Like, people ask me, what does an energy company care about what a boat company is doing? Well, wind turbine blades are manufactured and made out of fiberglass. Boats are made out of fiberglass. So we have common suppliers, and we are trying to address the same challenge at end of life, even though we're in completely different industries. And so again, that open collaboration, but also we look at the value chain and we say, where are our levers of influence? And it's often with our buying power. And so we've established specific sustainability criteria that we include in our tenders. And if those suppliers can meet that criteria, it credits them up to sort of 4% commercial offset in their offer. So depending on what it is we are procuring, if it's a service like a field service, a technician, things like that, we might say we would like to use a small business enterprise or a woman-owned business or a minority-owned business, and we're going to incentivize that by if you have that standing, we're going to give you kind of credit for that because we need to diversify our supply chain. We need to diversify our business. In other cases, it could be, wow, we buy this really technical product from you. We don't know what we're going to do with it at our end of life. If you guarantee that you will take it back and recycle it or repurpose it, then we're going to give you that sort of offset, right, for extended producer responsibility. And so there are different mechanisms in terms of the finances you use, but we also hold a lot of workshops. And you have to look at the entire value chain, I think, from soup to nuts. And that's where I always go back to design stage, right? And designing out the waste materials, the pollution, the unfriendly chemicals, whatever it may be, is first and foremost, but then look at each stage of that value chain and ask yourself the questions, what can I influence? And where do I have the ability to make a difference? And of course, when Walmart, for example, issues the gigaton project and says they're going to become a regenerative company, well, then that's a big stick for the industry, right? And that's going to trickle down to people. But for smaller suppliers, I would focus on collaboration and where you have levers of influence.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. I was actually I'm looking at our time here, and I think we could probably go on for hours, but we only have a couple more minutes. But that's a great way, a great place to end. My closing question to each of you was going to be, how can this new economic model be accessible to all communities? And Peter, you started to touch on it. So I think the way that you ended it is a great end for you. But Jonathan or Sabira, anything that you would want to add to that? How can this be accessible? What parting words did you want to leave us with?
I'd start with it's not necessarily new. It is old, and just reminding us that we were essentially practicing some type of circular economy generations. The extractive, our ability to extract resources primarily through the massive amount of power available in fossil fuels, and in particular, extractive mindsets, has set us on this course. So we're just in a course correction right now. It's leaning into local and small and supporting those businesses that and you have faith are really working towards the things that you believe in. So,
and thank you for the correction. Not meaning new as in a new concept, but new for some communities, a new way to approach economic mobility for some communities.
Yeah.
Sabira?
I would say that oh my God, I'm blanking right now. The ability to, what we see as a startup for ourselves is we want to see that replicated across the city, across the state, across the country, is that in communities that have been excluded before and are probably practicing circular economy already, how could we make those models come to the forefront of society? How can we help scale them? What education or tools or support, financial support or investment are needed? Rethinking how we have relationships with those communities and really distributing knowledge and capital in a way that lifts the many and provides the tool set to build circular economy together. I think that's where the opportunity is.
Excellent. Thank you. Jonathan, Sabira, Peter, thank you for your time. I will turn it back over to Lisa to close us out.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you to all of our panelists. I'm so appreciative of your insights, your expertise. Thank you to all of you who participated and for your excellent questions. We're so glad you joined us. We will post this recording on the Forefront website, so please check at myforefront.org by the end of this week, and you'll see it posted. And for folks who might want to get plugged into the Chicago Coalition, Any last words on how to get engaged there, or how best to reach out?
Yes, I can share my contact information. I don't know if I could put it in the chat, but it's R Loper. So that's RLOPER at Pyxera Global, PYXERA global.org. And we can certainly share the information. I can connect you with my colleagues and we can share that out.
Terrific. Thank you all so much. Everyone take care, stay warm and be well. We'll talk with you again soon.